Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and we recently received an email from Airlam _237, or yeah, it's 237. Sorry if I butchered your username. And the question they had for us is, why are all starships always oriented in the same direction and facing the same direction during battles? Why do so many ships just do frontal assaults? Well, that's a great observation, and the answer to this is quite complex and requires a tiny wading pool full of Vaseline, 2 Ewoks, at least half a dozen Twilight Cabaret dancers, and a vial of Hut pheromones. Okay, the simple answer is that George Lucas was more focused on entertainment than hardcore science fiction when designing the space battles in Star Wars, and so Starfighter Doctrine is similar to World War II era fighter planes. Lucas actually used reference footage from World War II gun cams, and the entire Battle of Yavin Trench Run is loosely inspired by the movie Dam Busters, which is actually based on a real-life low-altitude bombing mission carried out by the British Royal Air Force against a German dam critical to the Nazis' heavy industry. Instead of hitting a tiny hole with a plasma torpedo, the real-life British bomber pilots had to essentially skip these modified bombs over a torpedo net guarding the dam to blow up their eventual target. Very, very cool story. This is also why a lot of times we see starfighters acting like they're flying through the air and battling against gravity and air resistance. It looks great, and it is also very entertaining. Now, for the capital ship battles, George referenced naval battles, from the Age of Sail, where you had ships of the line launching broadsides against one another, and also the Age of the Battleships, where you have long-range sniping from battleships using line-of-sight turbo-laser batteries. And yes, all of these ships are oriented in the same direction. They almost seem to be sailing on the same plane, as if they were duking it out on the ocean. Now, the key thing about all of these creative choices, whether it's the World War II dogfighting, the Age of Sail broadside exchanges, is that these combatants are within line of sight, sometimes directly on top of each other. This significantly condenses the space of the battlefield and makes things a lot more exciting visually, and also raises the stakes of what's happening on screen. Now, the reality is, if we actually have realistic space battles, I think because of the lack of obstruction in deep space, you would probably have very, very long-range battles, sometimes from one end of the system to another. These battles will look a lot more like what we see in The Expanse, which is also really exciting, but in a different way. But here's the thing, George Lucas only made a portion of Star Wars, right? He focused mainly on the 6 movies and also some of the animated content. There's actually a ton of different creators and artists who have been filling in the lore around these main movies, and some of these individuals have brought real depth and realism to the lore, including the space battles. Timothy Zahn's Thrawn, for instance, probably wouldn't be caught dead carrying out a frontal assault. He would probably not orient his ships all in the same direction, because, well, he's a military genius, but he's also a Chiss, and even though Thrawn serves the Empire's cultural heritage and service in the Chiss Expeditionary Force makes him quite different from the rank-and-file Imperial officers who command the Imperial fleet. To Palpatine's credit, he kind of recognized that Thrawn was different, but also a genius in his own way. You see, the Chiss faction called the Unknown Region home. This was a very dangerous and chaotic part of the galaxy. Because of previous celestial events, there are many gravitational anomalies in their region, making the establishment of permanent hyperspace lanes extremely hard. This also affected the ability for individual species and factions to kind of reach out and establish diplomatic ties and economic ties with other factions, which, that usually leads to stability, and unfortunately that doesn't happen in the Unknown Region. And so what we have instead are a few isolated beacons of civilization like Chiss space, and in the spaces in between there's just utter chaos. You have like xeno-barbarian hordes just going around taking out weak factions. The Chiss were never a huge faction or the most powerful faction, and so they relied on subterfuge to keep their people safe. For instance, the Chiss homeworld suffered some cataclysmic weather climate phenomenon that basically iced over the entire planet, and the Chiss didn't want other factions to realize that this had happened, so what they did was they started rotating people to the surface, to areas where a lot of off-worlders might come to visit, like, the spaceports, the hotel areas. There would be a lot of, I guess you'd call them Chiss actors, who were playing this part, when in reality, most of the Chiss population had already fled the homeworld to other planets or were living deep underground. this is how the Chiss liked to operate. They never wanted anyone to know what kind of cards they were holding. Thrawn served in the Chiss Expeditionary Defense Fleet, an organization with a name that is already kind of confusing. Like an expeditionary force is a highly mobile task force that is usually deployed on offensive missions, but this does reflect the Chiss's idea that a good defense must be proactive. Now, the CEDF was mainly a scouting force because it had very strict rules of engagement, and any engagement against an enemy force could create really, dire political consequences for the people or the factions involved. CEDF units were usually pretty small and lacked firepower and depended on advanced technology to keep themselves hidden. And so Thrawn always had to be at the top of his game in order to win any encounter he faced. To make matters even worse, a lot of the battles Thrawn engaged in could be considered first contact with another species, so there is actually no way to determine what the potential of an enemy fleet is in those situations. Now, Thrawn was a savant, and he was a tactical genius as well, and I think it's very clear that he saw the battlefield as a 360 3D space. Thrawn was famous for baiting enemies to exploit gaps in his lines and then hitting them with reserve forces, usually taking micro jumps and exploiting their flanks or blind spots above and below. But Thrawn was a genius, a 1 in a billion occurrence. For a terrestrial being like Thrawn to think in this way is very unintuitive. I mean, take a look at how we are built as humans. Take a look at our eye placement. Both eyes are close together and side by side. This gives us pretty decent horizontal vision. We can focus on what is to the left of us and to the right of us. We have pretty good binocular focus abilities to concentrate on things on the horizon to judge depth. But when it comes to verticality, we have some pretty big blind spots. Like, you could have no idea that there is a gigantic spider on your ceiling. Don't look, because you'll freak it out. Spiders like T-Rexes sense our inner bitch and will attack if we show fear. But yeah, that's a problem for us. We have blind spots vertically. And this makes us very different from other species that grow up in different environments, like birds or even fish. And this is not something most people think about because they're not crazy like I am. But if we were ever to encounter some kind of xeno-avian species, we probably should avoid fighting them in deep space because cognitively, if they evolve to fly, they're going to understand the vertical space a lot better than us, ground-based humanoids. We'll get our ass kicked. They'll fly circles around us, take us at angles that we can't even begin to comprehend. Or worse, what if we fight against an aquatic alien species that has like a fish-like ancestry? You see, fish don't even need to see a predator before knowing it's there because they have pressure-sensing organs that can detect water displacement, vibration, and pressure. They also have very wide fields of view, but with far less binocular overlap than birds and humans, which means less precision in how they see, but a whole lot more situational awareness. I don't know if you guys have ever been to SeaWorld and, fought a dolphin in its natural habitat. It's not like a package you can buy. It's an option that unlocks once you consume enough frozen margaritas at the Expedition Cafe and Restaurant. But yeah, it's almost impossible to sneak up on a dolphin because they essentially map out the entire ocean around them. It's like having active sonar. Your best bet is range attack. Battle against aliens with like an aquatic lineage is also going to be very challenging and surprising for us humanoids walking on the ground. Now, obviously, there's no fluid dynamics in vacuum, but because of the way their cognition evolved around omnidirectional awareness and collective response, they would probably kick our ass, at least initially. Their fleets would look more like schools of fish and rely less on individual dogfighting skills. Everything would be coordinating en masse because of the way their brains are designed to work. You would basically see entire formations flowing and compressing and reorienting in response to your ship's movements like a terrifying pulsing organic mass. And so when a humanoid enters deep space, you might as well be jumping into the ocean. I don't know if you guys have ever dived near the end of a continental shelf where the ocean kind of just drops off into the black. Very terrifying view, in my opinion. But yeah, humans don't do well in wide open spaces. Heck, sometimes when I'm sitting out in a field and I tilt my head back and I look up at the clouds, or even when I'm walking around in the city, I'm looking up directly, I get this sense of vertigo because of the way our inner balance in our brain is built. Like when we lose sight of the ground and we're just kind of without any kind of context of where we are, our brain starts freaking out. That is vertigo. That is why we get dizzy. We are not even built to be able to operate in these kind of environments. And so for humans or for the Chiss, it takes a lot of training to prepare your brains for these environments. In the book Ender's Game, humanity is facing an alien invasion. And so the world government creates a battle school in orbit, to train the most brilliant children in the world to lead our fleet. In the battle room, the cadets engage in mock battles and learn how to communicate with each other, how to deploy tactics, how to adjust them on the run. But really the main point of the simulation was getting these kids used to a vertical battlefield. And Ender Wiggins, being a genius who did nothing wrong when he slaughtered the Xenos, developed a system that was quite intuitive and simple. He basically would tell his soldiers that the enemy's starting point is down, and everything else should be oriented in that way. Establishing this type of orientation before a battle starts is incredibly important in keeping everyone on the same page. Otherwise, how do you communicate with each other? You can't just say, oh, above you or behind you if you don't establish your bearings. And as you'll see, this idea of establishing which way is down is something that Ender Wiggins will use in the very real simulations that he fights later on, when actually humanity is taking the fight to the bugger homeworlds.
Ender, the enemy's gate is down.
But here's the thing, despite the genius of Ender Wiggins and Thrawn, the actual crew inside the ships, or the remote pilots for the drones, are still humanoids. We can train people to think vertically, we can build intricate sensors and displays that give us more views of the entire space, but our brains are optimized for gravity-bound environments with a dominant plane of interaction. Which is why most starships in the Enderverse and in Star Wars are built with a very clear bow and stern, and are not just spheres with omnidirectional capabilities. That is really just based on our cognitive limitations. This is just what we can handle. Let me take a look at the old Republic-era Hammerhead cruisers, one of the most prolific and long-serving ships in the galaxy. This thing was built like a lawn dart. All weapons are clustered towards the front, all the shielding, armor, and sensors are also placed there. And these ships naturally are going to be carrying out frontal assaults and lack protection in the rear, top, bottom, and flanks. Why would the peace-loving Republic design such an aggressive-looking ship? Well, again, take a look at how our eyes are shaped, the binocular vision, our precision when it comes to looking at things in front of us. The ships are designed to take advantage of our strengths, basically. Same thing goes for the Venator-class Star Destroyer, or basically any Star Destroyer. I mean, these things are basically just giant arrows that point in one direction. So even if your commander is a savant and fully understands 3D space, and you have a battle plan that fully takes advantage of that 3D space, the individual units at a tactical level are still likely going to be looking at the battlefield in a relatively 2D plane, especially because these ships also have artificial gravity, which orients the ship in a top-down manner. And so when you take a look at the Clone Wars, for instance, you have these highly disciplined clone crews that are also staffed with some judicial forces, and it's very likely that they understand the verticality of the battlefield and how to see space in a 3D form. But who exactly is leading these engagements? Who are the commanders? It's the Jedi, and sometimes even their Padawans, and most of these individuals do not have a good grasp of naval combat or how to properly interact with their crews or coordinate fleets in combat. I mean, how could they? There was no Republic Navy or Jedi Navy for 1,000 years before Obi-Wan Kenobi accidentally stumbled upon the facility in Geonosis. The Jedi had to learn on the job, and you don't simply just learn how to command a naval fleet. That led to a lot of disastrous things happening. And to simplify things, I think most Jedi commanders just bunched up all of their forces, had them facing the same direction, and carried out frontal assaults. I mean, a lot of the early kind of attempts to break blockades, like at Christophsis or on Ryloth, basically used this tactic. And it makes sense because this is how the Jedi have always fought. These are super beings who can block blaster bolts with their lightsabers. They don't need to be smart. They don't need a flank or maneuver to put themselves in a better position. They dominate their enemies by rushing at them. This makes them extremely poor naval commanders. I also like to add that, over certain battles, like when you're over a planet, like during the Battle of Coruscant, I do think it is natural to align your ships with the gravitational pull of the planet, which is why most ships are oriented the same way during that battle. Although from what I recall, the initial arrival of Grievous's forces really surprised the local Coruscant home defense fleet because they were all oriented with the top of their ships facing upwards and the bottom of their ships facing the planet. But when Grievous's navy arrived, it was basically pointing directly at the planet. And so this was like the defense fleet, and this was Grievous's fleet, and they just basically came down and cut them into little pieces. And I'm actually pretty sure when Obi-Wan Kenobi arrived with the Circle fleet, the same thing happened. They also dove in and, did a lot of damage. Ultimately, this comes down to training and doctrine. You can fix these things. You can teach your commanders not to orient your ships to gravitational pull, but to the most likely approach vector for enemy ships. I'm sure as the war went on, there were more experiments, more usage of flanking maneuvers, microdrones, and stuff like that, more kind of a change in how to view the battlefield. But again, the Clone Wars just happened and surprised everyone. There was no time to really adjust to this type of warfare. Now, the Imperial Navy that follows the Republic Navy suffers from a similar lack of real combat experience. The Imperial Navy spent its first decade chasing down smugglers and oppressing Xeno factions who didn't have navies. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer was primarily a weapon of fear, and then like an artillery platform, and occasionally an FOB for like ground invasions. Though the last year of the Galactic Civil War, the Imperial Navy didn't really engage in many large-scale naval battles. I mean, the Imperial fleet was really just the weapon of fear. Battle formations were designed to impress and not necessarily optimal for countering fast-moving rebel fleets and snub fighters hopping in from hyperspace at different vectors. So, why do most naval fleets orient themselves in the same direction when they are in formation? It's because navigating in these environments are just completely unnatural for most humanoids. And sometimes you just want to simplify things as much as possible so that you don't lose cohesion and break formation because of confusion. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below. Send me some more questions. I'm always looking for interesting things to inspire this brain. Well, I'll see you next time. My name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.